Treason was the one crime rulers feared most, and they made sure the punishment fit the betrayal. Traitors had to suffer, their flesh flayed from their bones, their bodies boiled alive, their screams transformed into the bellowing of a bronze beast. Execution wasn't just about justice, it was a performance. From being cooked alive inside a metal bull to rotting in their own filth as insects devoured them from the inside, these punishments were designed to make death feel like mercy. Today, we unveil the 10 most brutal punishments ever inflicted on traitors. So twisted, they redefine the very meaning of suffering. Number 10. Hanged, drawn, and quartered. In medieval England, high treason was considered the most heinous of all crimes, and for such betrayal, a simple execution was deemed insufficient. The punishment had to match the magnitude of the offense, which led to the development of perhaps history's most methodical public execution, being hanged, drawn, and quartered. The process began with the traitor being dragged through the streets on a wooden hurdle, a journey designed to inflict pain and public humiliation. Upon reaching the execution site, usually Tyburn in London, the condemned would face the gallows, but not for a quick death. They would be hanged until nearly dead, experiencing the terror of strangulation but denied its release. Still conscious, the traitor would then be cut down and laid on a table. The executioner, often working before crowds that numbered in the thousands, would cut open the victim's abdomen and remove what was inside, all while they remained alive. Only after this prolonged torment would the mercy of death finally come, as the victim's heart came out. The corpse would then be beheaded and the body divided into 4 quarters. The parts would then be displayed in prominent locations around the kingdom, often London Bridge or town gates, dipped in tar to preserve them for months. One of the most famous victims of this punishment was William Wallace, the Scottish freedom fighter portrayed in the film Braveheart. In 1305, Wallace was subjected to the full horror of being hanged, drawn, and quartered in London. His dismembered parts were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth. This punishment remained in English law until 1870, when it was formally abolished, although the last execution of this kind occurred in 1782. Number 9. The Brazen Bull. In 6th century BC Sicily, a tyrant named Phalaris ruled the city of Akragas with an iron fist. When a bronze worker named Persian approached him with a new invention, Phalaris found the perfect tool to punish those who challenged his authority. Persian had created the Brazen Bull, a hollow bronze statue of a bull, life-sized and meticulously crafted, and became one of history's most diabolical execution devices. The condemned would be placed inside the metal bull through a door in its side. A fire would then be lit beneath this statue, gradually heating the metal until it became red hot. As the person inside was slowly roasted alive, their screams would pass through specially designed tubes in the bull's nostrils. These tubes were engineered with acoustic properties that transformed human screams into the sound of a bellowing bull. The victim's agony became macabre music, while smoke from their burning body exited the bull's nostrils, appearing as if the bronze beast were alive and angry. According to historical accounts, Phalaris was so impressed with this invention that he decided to test it immediately on Persian himself. The inventor was placed inside his own creation, though allegedly removed before death, only to be thrown off a cliff afterward. A traitor to humanity through his cruel invention, Persian suffered the fate he had designed for others. Number 8. Scaphism, the boats. Perhaps no method of execution in history was as calculated in its cruelty as the ancient Persian punishment known as Scaphism, or the boats. The procedure began with the condemned, usually traitors to the Persian Empire, being stripped naked and fastened between 2 hollow wooden boats, or sometimes hollowed-out logs that matched in size and shape, creating a kind of human sandwich. The victim's head, hands, and feet would protrude from this wooden prison. The executioners would then force the condemned to consume milk and honey, far more than they could comfortably eat. The same mixture would be applied to their exposed body parts, particularly the eyes, ears, mouth, and private areas. Then the boat-encased victim would be left floating in a stagnant pond. The combination of exposure, forced overconsumption, and the honey smeared on their body would quickly lead to extreme diarrhea. The victim would soil themselves within their wooden tomb, and the mixture of feces and honey would attract insects which would begin to feast on the exposed parts of the victim's body. As days passed, the victim's excrement would accumulate within the boats, attracting more insects which would begin to breed in the human waste and eventually within the victim's body itself. Death came slowly from dehydration, starvation, exposure, or septic shock from the massive infections that developed. One of the most famous accounts of this punishment comes from Plutarch, who described the execution of Mithridates, a soldier who killed Cyrus the Younger. Mithridates survived in this condition for 17 days before finally succumbing to death. Alright, before we get to the next punishment, I have a quick ask. If you're enjoying this video, would you please like and subscribe? It helps me bring you new stories multiple times a week. Thank you to all who do. Now, let's continue our journey through history's darkest chapters. Number 7. Boiling to death. Water, the source of life, became an instrument of unimaginable death for traitors in medieval Europe. Execution by boiling involved immersing the condemned in a cauldron or large container filled with boiling water, oil, tar, or even molten lead. What made this method particularly horrific was that the victims weren't always submerged all at once. In many cases, they were lowered slowly into the boiling liquid feet first, prolonging their suffering as they were essentially cooked alive. In England, this punishment gained official sanction during the reign of Henry VIII. In 1531, Parliament passed a law making boiling alive the standard punishment for poisoners who were considered a particularly treacherous type of murderer. The first recorded victim under this statute was Richard Roos, a cook in the household of the Bishop of Rochester, convicted of poisoning food that killed 2 people. One eyewitness account for Roos's execution describes how he was chained to a post in a large cauldron which was gradually filled with boiling water. The chronicle describes how the man first had his feet, then his hands, and gradually his whole body consumed and devoured to death. Similar punishments were recorded across Europe and Asia. In Japan, this method was used not just for traitors, but for Christian missionaries during periods when Christianity was forbidden. Number 6. Impalement. The name Vlad the Impaler strikes fear even today, centuries after his death, but the Romanian ruler didn't invent the punishment that earned him his grim nickname. Impalement has ancient origins, with evidence of its use dating back to the Code of Hammurabi in 1772 BC. The method involved driving a wooden or metal stake through the victim's body. Gravity would gradually force the victim's body down the stake, resulting in a slow, agonizing death that could last for days. Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, modern-day Romania, elevated this punishment to unprecedented levels during his campaigns against Ottoman invaders and his own treasonous nobles in the 15th century. Historical accounts tell of fields containing thousands of impaled victims, a forest of the dying that terrified even hardened invaders. The skill of the executioner determined the victim's suffering. If the stake pierced vital organs, death came relatively quickly, but skilled executioners could guide the stake through the body without causing immediately fatal damage, extending the victim's suffering for days. Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, a man familiar with brutality himself, reportedly turned back his army when confronted with the sight of 20,000 impaled corpses outside Vlad's capital. The psychological warfare worked. Despite being vastly outnumbered, Vlad's reputation for brutality against traitors and enemies gave even the mighty Ottoman Empire pause. Number 5. The Judas Cradle. During the Spanish Inquisition, heresy was considered the ultimate betrayal, not just of the crown, but of God himself. Among the many instruments of torture developed during this dark period, few were as psychologically and physically devastating as the Judas Cradle. The device consisted of a pyramid-shaped seat with a point facing upward. The condemned would be placed at the tip of this pyramid, usually naked, with the point inserted just slightly into the body. The victim's legs would be tied together, forcing their full body weight onto this excruciating connection point. What made the Judas Cradle particularly cruel was its slow, inexorable action. Initially, the victim might be suspended above the point, lowered just enough to create pressure but not penetration. Over hours or days, they would be gradually lowered further, their own body weight working against them as gravity slowly forced them down onto the point. The device was named after Judas Iscariot, the disciple who betrayed Jesus, a fitting name for a punishment meant primarily for traitors and heretics. The psychological component was as important as the physical torture. Victims knew their suffering would only increase with time, and the only relief would come through confession. Interrogators could manipulate the victim's suffering by adding weights to their legs, bouncing them on the point, or leaving them in the position for days with the constant pain preventing sleep. Records from the Spanish Inquisition suggest some victims were left on the device for over 24 hours at a time. While the Judas Cradle is most associated with medieval Spain, similar devices appeared throughout Europe during periods of religious and political conflict, evolving in design but maintaining the same basic principle of using the victim's body weight to inflict gradual, intensifying suffering. Number 4. Flaying alive. Few punishments throughout history have combined the physical agony, psychological terror, and symbolic significance of flaying, the methodical removal of a person's skin while they remained alive. The ancient Assyrian Empire, which dominated Mesopotamia from approximately 900 to 600 BC, perfected this punishment as both a military tactic and a response to treason. Assyrian palace reliefs and historical accounts describe the practice in chilling detail. Victims, usually rebel leaders or rulers of conquered territories who had broken their oaths of loyalty, would be carefully skinned alive, their hides then displayed on city walls as warnings. Some accounts describe victims surviving for days in this condition, their exposed muscles and nerves creating unimaginable agony with every movement or breath. The Aztec Empire similarly employed flaying as punishment for serious transgressions, with the additional ritual element of priests sometimes wearing the skins of victims in religious ceremonies, particularly during festivals honoring Xipe Totec, the flayed lord. Despite its ancient origins, flaying continued well into the medieval period. During the First Crusade, Christian knights were reportedly flayed alive after being captured during the siege of Jerusalem in 1099. In medieval Europe, the punishment became less common, but was still occasionally used for particularly severe cases of treason. Perhaps the most famous historical case comes from the Ottoman Empire, when Venetian commander Marcantonio Bragadin surrendered the city of Famagusta to Ottoman forces in 1571 after a long siege. He was initially guaranteed safe passage. However, Ottoman commander Lala Mustafa Pasha accused him of treachery and ordered him flayed alive. Bragadin's skin was stuffed with straw and paraded around the city on a cow before being sent to Constantinople as a trophy. Number 3. The Siberian Gulag. The Soviet Gulag system, particularly the camps in the remote reaches of Siberia, represented punishment through prolonged torment rather than immediate execution. Following the Russian Revolution and throughout Stalin's reign, millions labeled as enemies of the state or traitors to the revolution were sent to these remote labor camps. Among them were political dissidents, military officers suspected of disloyalty, and ordinary citizens denounced by neighbors or colleagues. Prisoners were transported in unheated cattle cars across thousands of miles, often in the dead of Siberian winter where temperatures plunged to -50 degrees Celsius. Those who survived the journey faced a calculated regime of suffering. Prisoners worked 14-hour days in mines, forests, or construction projects, regardless of weather conditions. Daily food rations often consisted of just 300 grams of bread and watery soup, approximately 400 to 700 calories, while the work demanded 2,000 to 3,000 calories daily. This mathematical equation ensured gradual starvation. In winter, frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and faces. In summer, clouds of mosquitoes and midges tormented prisoners working in the taiga. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who documented the Gulag system in his landmark work, The Gulag Archipelago, described it as a system designed not to correct or reform, but to weaken, exhaust, and destroy. The genius of the system was its industrialization of suffering, turning punishment into an economic engine that extracted every last calorie of energy from the condemned before discarding their remains. Prisoners disappeared into this system, many never to return, their fates unknown even to their families. This uncertainty, not knowing if a loved one was alive or dead, created a different kind of torture for those left behind. Number 2. Death by 1,000 cuts. Imperial China developed one of history's most methodical and symbolic executions in Ling Chi, often translated as death by 1,000 cuts or slow slicing. In traditional Chinese belief, preserving the body intact was sacred, an obligation to one's ancestors. Ling Chi deliberately violated this principle, ensuring the condemned would be spiritually incomplete in the afterlife. The procedure began with the victim being tied to a wooden frame in a public place. The executioner, working with a sharp knife, would methodically remove small pieces of flesh from the body, typically starting with the breasts, proceeding to the arms, legs, and finally the chest. The process could continue for hours, with care taken to avoid immediately fatal wounds. The number of cuts varied. Despite the common name, historical records suggest between 3 and 120 cuts was typical, not literally 1,000. Witnesses described executioners sometimes providing opium to victims, not from mercy, but to ensure they remained conscious to experience the full punishment. Emperor Guangxu's consort, Lady Jin, suffered this fate in 1861 after being accused of plotting against the Xianfeng Emperor. Her execution reportedly took an entire afternoon, with imperial guards ensuring each cut was witnessed by gathered officials as a warning against disloyalty. The psychological dimension of Ling Chi extended beyond the victim. Family members were often forced to watch, participating in the punishment and sharing in the dishonor. While Ling Chi was officially abolished in 1905 as China modernized its legal system, the last recorded instance occurred in 1910. Number 1. Execution by cannon. Our final method combines brutal efficiency with maximum public impact: execution by cannon, a punishment favored particularly by the British Empire in India and the Ottoman Empire for dealing with mutineers and traitors. The procedure was grimly straightforward. The condemned would be tied to the mouth of a cannon, their back or chest pressed against the muzzle. When fired, the cannon would not just kill the victim, it would obliterate them, scattering their remains widely and making traditional burial impossible. This method gained particular prominence during the Indian Rebellion of 1857 against British colonial rule. After suppressing the uprising, British authorities executed captured rebels by tying them to cannons. Contemporary accounts describe how crowds were forced to watch these executions, with as many as 40 men blown apart in a single day. The British selected this method with calculated cultural awareness. For many Indians, proper funeral rites were essential for the soul's journey after death. By literally blasting bodies apart, the British ensured that these spiritual traditions could not be observed, adding a dimension of religious punishment to the physical execution. The Ottoman Empire employed the technique for similar reasons. During the Greek War of Independence in the 1820s, captured revolutionaries were executed by cannon in public squares. The psychological impact on witnesses was severe. The sudden transformation of a human being into scattered fragments created a shock that conventional executions could not achieve. Beyond the immediate horror, execution by cannon served strategic purposes. The spectacular nature of the punishment created memorable terror, while the complete destruction of the body eliminated the possibility of burial sites becoming martyrs' shrines or rallying points for further resistance. Today, most nations have abandoned such practices, recognizing them as violations of fundamental human rights. International law now prohibits torture and cruel punishment. Yet understanding this dark history remains important, not as macabre curiosity, but as a reminder of how justice systems can be perverted when power faces challenges from within. The punishments we've explored also force us to confront uncomfortable questions about human nature. What does it say about us that such methods were not just conceived, but meticulously refined over centuries? And what does it reveal about the psychology of power that rulers throughout history reached for increasingly theatrical forms of cruelty when they felt threatened? Perhaps most importantly, these historical practices help us appreciate the long, difficult journey toward more humane systems of justice, a journey that in many parts of the world remains incomplete. Thank you for joining us on Nefarious History. If you found this journey through history's darkest chapters fascinating, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Every week we explore the hidden stories, forgotten figures, and overlooked events that shaped our world, and we don't want you to miss it.